Chapter 12. No Shotgun Required. The first symptom of love in a young man is shyness. The first symptom in a woman, it is boldness. Victor Hugo. Chris stopped in at the house for lunch, rinsing the dirt off his hands. It was April and planting season was in full swing. He felt an almost electrical current of stress in the air from the moment he walked in. Carrie and Liza were both in the kitchen, and Liza looked tense. He gave his wife a quick kiss and tilted his head at Liza. "What's up, Liza?" His sister-in-law was chewing nervously on a slender fingernail. She glanced toward the den. "Gramps is in the den with Carl." "What for?" Chris began to ask, and then thought of Carl and Liza's more outward signs of affection recently, and groaned. Oh boy. He had caught the two kissing and holding hands several times. It was just a matter of time before Fenton caught on, if he hadn't already. Carl had been a regular visitor on the farm for over 2 years now, and it wasn't as if the writing wasn't on the wall. The two had been an item for quite a while. Liza was quick to defend herself. "I'm not pregnant." Her face flushed at the thought. Carl and I, it's just time, that's all. He asked me and I said yes." "Yes to sex or yes to getting married?" Chris asked, a playful smile on his lips. Carrie slapped his arm, her mouth turned down disapprovingly, but her eyes crinkled at the corners, a sure sign of amusement. Liza glared at him. "Oh yeah, Chris Aronson, you're one to talk." She had a point. He and Carrie had mixed up the natural order of things, as her grandfather had put it. That had been nearly 3.5 years ago, and their marriage was a good one, despite the losses they had endured. Carrie's first pregnancy had ended in a premature birth, and there had been several heartbreaking miscarriages since. Fenton had come around eventually, although the sight of the shotgun still gave Chris pause. "If you must know, Mr. Smarty Pants, Carl asked me to marry him. They've been in there for a few minutes." She bit off another fingernail and said, "I think it's going well. He hasn't started yelling yet." That hopeful moment was shattered. "Where's my shotgun?" Fenton bellowed from the den. Chris winced. "Oh yeah, Liza, that went really well." He then grinned at Carrie, remembering several moments of shotgun-induced terror that the old man had brought on for him. His wife rolled her eyes at him and walked toward the den to head the old man off. Carl came out of the den first and made a beeline for Liza, who grabbed his arm and pulled him close. She wrapped a determined arm around his waist and whispered something in his ear, then kissed him. This earned another bellow from Fenton, who was limping down the hallway, Carrie slowing him down only the slightest bit. "Are you pregnant, young lady?" Fenton was unusually brusque with his youngest granddaughter. Liza stood her ground, holding Carl in his place and shushing him with a determined look. "Nope, Gramps, not yet." Her hazel eyes snapped with mischief. "But if you give us half an hour, I'll see what I can do." Fenton gaped at her. For that matter, they all did. Carl looked terrified. Sir, I don't think she meant that." "Oh, yes, I did," Liza said, her jaw firmly set. Chris looked bemused. Carrie stood wide-eyed, and Carl's face had broken into a sheen of sweat. "Gramps, I'm not a kid anymore." "You are 16 years old," Fenton bellowed. "I'm 17 years old, Gramps, almost 18. And I know what I want," Liza countered. Chris watched with admiration. The Purdue women were strong-willed, and Liza was probably the most strong-willed one of them all. Carrie held some of her mother's quiet calm, but Liza was fire and ice, especially when she felt strongly about something. She stood there, back straight, immovable in the face of her grandfather's wrath. Fenton faltered, ever so slightly, his wrath fading as he grasped at straws.
"What would your parents say to you getting married this young?"
His eyes began to redden, and the old man looked exhausted.
"You are barely more than children."
His gruff demeanor was nothing but a facade, and the vulnerability Fenton tried so hard to keep hidden came sliding into view. Above all things, he loved his 3 grandchildren and his grandson-in-law. He loved them fiercely, deeply. Liza's tone changed in response. "The world is different, Gramps. Carl and I—" She pulled Carl closer and stepped forward toward her grandfather. "We've talked about this for a long time, and we love each other." She stared into the old man's eyes that reminded her so much of her father, gone for nearly 8 years now. Isaac would have liked Carl just as Fenton did. "We're getting married, Gramps." Her words were a statement, not a question. A moment passed and no one spoke. Then Liza continued. "So, will you give us your blessing?" Fenton closed his eyes in exhaustion. He did not understand these young people, so eager to hunt for blueberries and get married. But he knew resolution when he saw it, and his granddaughter was full of it. Heck, the girl was overflowing with resolution. He thought about all of the smiles, the surreptitious hand-holding he had tried his best to ignore, and the way Carl fit into the farm just as Chris had. A good fit. Fenton opened his eyes and looked at Liza, standing there, Carl at her side. She looked so beautiful and so resolute. She had always known her own mind, and fearlessly faced her future. Just last fall she had successfully operated on one of the town boys who had come down with acute appendicitis. She had saved that 9-year-old's life and firmly established herself as the town's doctor. Since then, there had been a stream of steady visitors who would knock on the farmhouse door day or night, with varying degrees of injuries and illness. At 17, Liza was accepted by Tiptonville residents as the best at doctoring in the area, as old Otis Lyles had said to him at Christmas, while Liza looked after a nasty cut the frail centenarian had received after he fell in his cluttered parts shop. It seemed that Fenton was the only one who still saw the wide-eyed child who had stood waiting with her mother and older sister at the airport, her hair parted down the middle and fastened into 2 neat braids. All of them wearing black, and still reeling from the loss of his son Isaac in the Amtrak train bombings. Amy, heavily pregnant, Carrie, her thin young face drawn with grief, and Liza, who had just looked up at him, opened her arms wide for him to pick her up, and said nothing. She had nestled her face in his neck and wrapped her small arms around him tightly. To him, she was still that little girl. But it was time he saw her for what she was, a young woman who knew her own mind. Wearily, he mustered a half-frown. Why, oh why, did they all have to grow up so quickly? "Fine," he said. "You have my blessing." Then he pointed a gnarled finger at Carl, who looked very relieved. "And you just wait on any fun stuff until after the wedding, you understand me, young man?" "Yes, sir," Carl nodded, and despite Liza's efforts to the contrary, he kept that promise. They had a June wedding. Their first child, Molly Ann Owens, was born on Valentine's Day the following year.